Hello viewers, welcome to our program. In the face of the present energy crisis, finding other sources of energy in our economy and reducing our dependence on fossil fuels has become a big challenge. In this program, we're going to talk about alternative automotive fuels. And for this purpose, we are pleased to have in our studio Mr. Marsh, automotive expert at Kangan Batman Institute of TAFE, Australia. Mr. Marsh, welcome again.
Thank you.
So, first of all, could you tell us more about the purpose of your visit in Mauritius?
Yeah, the IVTB invited me across as part of their ongoing training to educate instructors and people in the industry. So basically, the two courses we ran, two workshops were automotive fuels and alternative engines, and then the repair and maintenance of automatic transmission systems. So those two areas can be linked together for fuel saving purposes.
Okay, so one of your objectives is to discuss about alternative forms of fuels. But according to you, Mr. Marsh, why is there a need to shift from the traditional petrol that we use to alternative forms of fuel?
Well, look, it's a very difficult question to answer succinctly, but there is some benefits. Obviously, the obvious one is to cut your imports. The other one is to reduce environmental gases and pollution. And I think possibly there's governments have signed up to a carbon footprint reduction. And so these are the areas where if you can reduce your fossil fuels by burning alternative fuels, that you address most of these issues.
Okay, so now in the Mauritian context, what are the proposals for alternative automotive fuels?
Well, look, the one that you have already is LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, and it's a product again that you have to import. It's a fossil fuel.
And what it is exactly in common language?
LPG.
Yeah.
Well, it's a gas that can be either produced specifically or as a byproduct of petrol and diesel production, and it's compressed to turn it into a liquid, just for ease of transportation, basically, and for compactness, as opposed to, say, something like natural gas, which has to be cryogenically stored to have the volume to make it usable. So LPG is a good fuel. Some manufacturers say that it's up to 70% cleaner than petrol.
Okay.
So it's very popular overseas, very popular in Europe, very popular in Australia. It's cheap. It's potentially cheap. So the other two, ethanol, is something new to Mauritius, I think. You haven't got it at the moment. There's development work going on. But it would be an excellent choice here because of your sugar cane. Okay. So you could use it as byproduct, use the fuel as a byproduct from your sugar cane. So therefore you reduce your importation of fossil fuels. And then the other one is biodiesel, which is again produced mainly from plants, and it's used in diesel. So
the biodiesel, is it a substitute for diesel, or?
Yeah. It's not a full substitute, no. Yeah. It's not a full substitute, and these there's a fair chance to say that no fuel in my lifetime, being older, or even probably yours, that you'll have a full substitute. And I think it's probably important to realise that, particularly ethanol, which is running E5 and E10, if you went to 100% ethanol on all vehicles in the world, there wouldn't be enough cropping area with current methods to run the vehicles. You'd need two worlds to grow it. So it'll probably be, for a foreseeable future, generally it'll be it'll make up part of the fuel mix.
Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about ethanol. In our country, we do produce ethanol. But do you think the ethanol produced will be sufficient to provide fuels to the increasing number of cars we have on our roads?
Well, and again, that part of it, my main expertise is in fixing cars and the problems that occur through introducing new fuels. And this has happened over the years. But as far as the ethanol goes, it would come down to the amount of liquid ethanol produced per hectare of, particularly in your case, sugarcane. If that was substantial, then there's a definite possibility to run vehicles on it. I think it's ideally suited to Mauritius, so I can't see why it wouldn't work. And the beauty of it, of course, is that it, you're using the pollution you're creating, you're then absorbing by next year's crops. And of course, that is the best thing about it. It's just got a lovely ring to it, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So ethanol is a good thing.
Okay. Now, you just mentioned about E5 and E10.
Yep.
So what I would like to know is, are we going to substitute petroleum by ethanol altogether, or will it be a mixture of ethanol and petroleum?
It'll be a mixture. In the foreseeable future, it'll be a mixture. Now you have other countries in the world, and Brazil is probably the most famous, that runs their vehicles on E85. In America, they're running them on E85, which means 85% ethanol and 15% petrol, basically.
Okay.
It without getting too complicated, again, Mauritius is beautifully suited to do that because you've got a very stable climate. Countries that don't have a stable climate, the technical reasons that I don't think we need to go into, that basically hot and cold have a different effect on the fuel. And so, E85 is not just E85, it is modified, diluted down, so more petrol put in it in colder times or in colder areas. Mm-hmm. In America, there are some studies to say that there are some issues involved, health issues involved with E85. If the number of vehicles is substantial, like let's say all vehicles are running E85, there's some health issues, and asthma being one of them, that you could have a detrimental side to it. So I think at this stage,
because of using E85,
there are. It's not 100% clean gas. Not burning anything is not 100% clean, And I think we could probably go and talk about, the pollution control on a number of vehicles that is already there. And if you introduce a new fuel, then the work to introduce new pollution control devices has to be carried out at the same time. And this is being done. But some studies, and one was mentioned in an English paper in Mauritius here, the Sunday paper, I think it's called. Mm-hmm. And it was referring to a study done in America that projects these sorts of health issues if the number of vehicles are running E85 by 2020. So I think at the short term, E5 and E10 is what the vehicles will run. That's what we'll get used to. In the Mauritian context, maybe we'll be using E5 and E10 and not E85, which does much harm to the environment, actually. Yeah, well, I think that's what'll happen. I think that's what's happening through the rest of the world. And excuse me, it's the development of the engine to cope with these new fuels has got to be part and parcel of the development of the new fuels. So you can't just have one without the other.
Okay, so E5 means 5% ethanol and 95% petroleum, and E10 is 10% ethanol and 90% petrol. So in short, we'll definitely decrease our dependence on petrol by 5 or 10%, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, now what are the advantages of, the main advantages of using ethanol compared to petrol, of course?
Well, look, it does vary around the world. Countries, that don't have crops like you've got, like sugarcane, that can use the byproduct as a fuel source, then obviously have to grow a specific product for that. And so that is going to lead to problems with, do you use the fuel, the crop for the fuel source at the expense of the crop for the human fuel? And that's the issue that's got to be addressed. And to a certain extent it is being addressed in the way that new crops are being developed, that will grow on arid land. But that's outside Mauritius. Mauritius, I don't think, has that problem. I mean, you've got this renewable source, and that's the benefit. It's something that, as I said before, it will absorb some of the emissions, particularly the CO2, which is a greenhouse gas. It'll absorb those emissions with the next year's crop, and it'll obviously absorb the petrol emissions, the CO2 emissions as well. But there is a worldwide problem of not having enough trees to absorb all the emissions. So at least if you're absorbing some of them, it's a good thing.
Okay, so basically it will be the byproducts of sugarcane. And you just mentioned something, the food crops and fuel crops.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that, the difference between the two? Because you're right, maybe when we're trying to solve an energy crisis, we end up in a food crisis.
Yes.
That's what you mean to say.
Yes.
Elaborate a little bit on that, please.
Well, look, again, this is, as I say, I must say that my expertise is in fixing cars, but in the course of researching, I found out some things that, not alarming, but they just make common sense. So, first of all, if you've got a renewable source, that's perfect. If you've got to grow a source or create a source, and it might be algae production, it could be, some other form of crop seed that they turn into oil. That can that be used? The question you ask: can it be used, or should it be used for human fuel, or should it be used for automotive fuel?
Yeah.
And one of the issues that needs to be addressed, or understood more than addressed, is to work out what the governments around the world have signed up to, probably in the Kyoto Protocol, to reduce the carbon footprint. And that would then make a bit more sense of where everyone's heading, because for instance, there's no guarantee that the introduction of any sort of alternative fuel is going to reduce the actual cost of it, because these plants are set up, the plants that produce the fuel are set up at enormous cost. Development costs of billions of dollars around the world, and companies will have to recoup. The companies will have to recoup those costs. So the reduction, if there's no fuel saving to the average motorist in dollars in their pocket or rupees in their pocket, then it has to be done for the environment, and maybe people will think good about that. So there's a number of areas, but we shouldn't think that all countries are the same as Mauritius. They've got a very, very fortunate position here where you've got this crop that can be produced, and I don't know how much it's going to produce, but that's a question that should be asked. If you start growing algae, which is another proposal, then where do you do it? Is it going to be at the expense, if we're going to hollow out large areas of land to have ponds to grow algae? I mean, how much is it going to produce? And but I think this is early stages for everyone, very early stages, formative. It's cutting edge, and no one is going to know 100% for a number of years, but everyone's trying.
Yeah. Now, what about the disadvantages of E5 and E10, if any?
Well, look, the best way to look at that question is that the manufacturers of vehicles, that's the people that make the parts, make them for the fuel that's available at that point of time. And the fuel is set down to a standard, a strict standard, that needs to be enforced, because if it's not, then the fuel and the engine, particularly the engine, doesn't match, and damage can be done. Okay. So when you make a new fuel, if there's no changes done to the engine, that engine runs the possibility of having damage done to it. And a good example for that was when we changed there's two good examples actually. One, when we changed from unleaded petrol to leaded petrol.
Okay.
From leaded petrol to
unleaded, yeah.
To unleaded. You know, this caused problems, and it made some vehicles unable to drive, and it also destroyed engines, made them more polluting, and was generally a recipe for putting old vehicles off the road. You know, there are still a number of old vehicles running around, and again in Mauritius you're very lucky because you don't have lots of high speed or high load driving conditions. So your driving is done, you know, around the streets and is quite slow.
Okay.
So you don't have some of the issues. So if we go from there to then low sulphur diesel, which has also been introduced, and you'll go lower in the sulphur. Again, some problems occurred because the vehicles were made to have a higher sulphur content, and when the low sulphur was brought in, there was some problems with some vehicles, not all, but some. So the same rationale applies to, you know, we're changing now to E5 and E10, and there are some problems that occur. Now, you know, different studies prove different things, and it's not for me to pit one study against another, but the one in Australia was quite comprehensive and substantiated, a reputable company, very reputable company, and produced some documentation to say that there was some, not alarm, but some concern that some vehicles will have problems.
Okay. Now, Mr. Marsh, what would be the effect of the new forms of fuel on the performance of the vehicles themselves?
Yeah, well, that's probably continuing on from what we're saying. So, you know, the vehicles are made for a fuel. If you change that fuel from what it was made for, then there are problems that occur. So, and it's of a technical nature. It's to do with things like brass and non-ferrous metals can be attacked, particularly by ethanol. You know, the transportation of ethanol, that's where it's stored and how it's transported, is also of great concern. Totally different to the way petrol is concerned. Ethanol is hygroscopic; it actually absorbs water. Okay, so you know, if you have an atmosphere that is humid, that water can be absorbed. If the tanks that's stored in aren't properly cleaned, it can absorb water, and the water and ethanol will separate to the bottom. And of course, if the tanks are drained from the bottom, then you get this mix of water and ethanol that is not good for any car engine. So there are a number, and of course, if you don't produce all the ethanol you use here, if you have to import it, there are very, very strict guidelines and tests specific to ethanol, that how each shipment would have to be tested. And of course, if it's not tested properly, then that quality of the fuel, in other words, the standard, will be compromised, and people's vehicles will suffer as a result. So there's a lot of more checking need to be done with ethanol than there is with petrol.
Okay, now in Mauritius, vehicles like buses and vans run on diesel. And we also know that those vehicles cause lots of harm to the environment. Now, you as an expert, you've been in Mauritius for a few days. What is your opinion about the present situation in Mauritius?
Well, look, I'm not only a so-called expert, but you know, I'm also a father. I have grandchildren, so I'm a tourist to a certain extent. But there's grave concerns, I think, with the particulate emission. That's the black smoke, if you want, and not only the black smoke, but there's invisible particles that come out that we can't see that do damage. It is worldwide. It's well known now, right around the world, that is carcinogenic. It's probably one of the most toxic substances you can breathe in. This is not. I'm not just saying this to be alarmist. It's not alarmist. This is documented. Diesels have very strict and very clever ways of cleaning up this pollution. They're called particulate filters, and they go together with catalytic converters. that take the harmful pollutants, both visible and invisible, out of the exhaust gas. So a diesel exhaust, you should be able to run your finger around the tailpipe of the exhaust inside and it should come out clean.
Okay.
That is what a modern diesel can do. So that's the potential to have modern diesels is there, that are clean, totally clean. So when you look at diesels that are travelling your streets, that are polluting to the point that it's really serious, then you've got to say, why is that happening? Now, one of the things that happens around the world, or happened around the world before governments cracked down, was that lack of maintenance and lack of professional care on the vehicles was basically not done. You know, just simple maintenance. It might involve some cost to the owner, but the cost to the community is far more. So this is I think, apart from the introduction of ethanol and the introduction of biodiesel, the introduction of and policing of those issues would be a really good thing to happen to such a beautiful island. It's just a magnificent island, and then you see this other part that's not quite so beautiful.
Yeah. So what advice would you give to drivers or owners of buses to reduce the emission of black smoke?
Well, look, they just have to maintain the vehicles adequately. And you know, some of the vehicles here, look, I understand the economy here is different to Australia, but nevertheless, sometimes it doesn't take a lot. Maybe you know, you could have some sort of incentive, you know, that rather than just a draconian crackdown on the vehicles, you know, have some incentive for vehicles that don't pollute. You know, there's some sort of cost incentive, or it may be to aid people importing vehicles. You know, you could have, I know that for Prius, I think there's talk that there's there's a removal of the tax. You know, maybe to have that removal of tax for trucks, you know, so people can actually get rid of their old trucks, import a cleaner truck with the particulate emissions converters attached, and that way they'll be more powerful, they'll be able to carry more loads. And that was the other thing we noticed is and I think around the world they're called hungry boards, where the volume or the capacity of the truck is enlarged to the point where it's now unsafe, and therefore the engine will produce more harmful gases because it's being loaded beyond what it was ever intended to do. And so there's other issues there too, and I think we followed one in today, and I was told, what's he doing on this? I said, what's he doing on this back road? And the answer was, well, he won't go on the main road because he'll get caught for emitting, you know, pollutants. So look, and in Australia we had the same problem. We had the same problem, and the government offered incentives to the vehicle owners to repair their vehicles, and gave some assistance in that. So that it has to be done somehow. You either put the old vehicles off the road, or you clean them up. There is really only two alternatives.
Okay, so the most of the problems comes from older vehicles, actually.
That's right. It's not. I mean, I've talked to a number of your technical people here that overhaul diesel pump equipment, and they do say there is some issues with the fuel. And of course, without getting sidetracked too far, the fuel that leaves the refinery is guaranteed 100%. It then passes through a number of hands that can inadvertently, either consciously or unconsciously, degrade that fuel. And so when it gets to the actual vehicle, it's now not the same as it left the environment. That happens, the refinery. It happens in Australia, and I think it happens around the world. So,
well, to use these fuels, vehicles need to undergo changes. I think most of our car owners would want to know whether these changes would be costly or less costly. What could you enlighten us about it?
Probably the LPG one is one that a lot of people already understand. You know, there's a lot of publicity about LPG damaging engines, and it is true. Engines that weren't made for LPG can have some technical issues that lead to some damage in the engine, but the proviso is there if they're not tuned correctly. The same as any fuel can cause damage to an engine if it's not tuned properly. So tuning is essential, and it saves dollars because the engine runs more efficiently. LPG, because it has got some direct benefits in the harmful pollutions, and particularly the ones that produce smog, can also can have some issues with the engine. But if it's tuned properly, so in Australia we have a standard that the vehicles have to be fitted to.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Marsh. It's been an honour to have you here. Well, viewers, we've reached to the end of our today's programme. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.